Doing? About to hear it. Let's see here. So now I think I'm gonna give it a few more minutes to see if people are trickling in. But actually, do you want to do like highs and lows of the week?
All right, cool. What did you say? My laptop.
Gotcha. I mean, I'm gonna wait for more people to trickle on in.
Yeah.
But do you want to start like to get the ball moving? Do you want to do highs? Start doing highs and lows of the week?
I can start. I got my foster cat, so that's a high at the moment.
Very nice.
Yeah. He is a rascal. Uh he's a rascal at the moment. Yeah. I don't know. I don't have a low at the moment. But yeah.
Glad to hear that.
hmm
Do you want to do like popcorn style or?
Let me popcorn it to Caroline.
All right. My high this week is I made really good dinner last night, and I had a lot of fun doing it. And my low is that I have a philosophy paper to write this week, and I've been putting it off, and it probably won't take that long. I just don't want to do it. And I'm gonna pop the desk. She's right next to me, and I don't want to forget.
My high was that I got to eat the dinner that Caroline made last night, which slapped. My low is that I've chemically burned my face because I'm an idiot and it hurts a lot.
What did you do?
I have really sensitive skin and I'm just
You put acid on.
and I put acid on my face and it's just not.
Oh no.
Also,
Oh, here's my cat. If
Oh
you're
my
wondering.
goodness, he's so cute.
His name is Ducky, but yes.
Very nice.
Oh, I have another high, and it leads to the skeleton. So Tara, Jess, and I'll have testing done, and we all tested negative. And we got to go to my home and see my grandparents.
Oh.
And that was really cool. And then came from my car. Okay. And who you popcorn in it?
Tara. My high was eating the dinner that Caroline cooked and eating leftovers for lunch today. And my low is that I spent too much money on decorative gourds for the fall time. And I popcorn to Anthony.
Hey guys. So my high this week is probably getting a very good test score on my first exam. And so yeah, about that. My low would be not getting enough sleep. Really sleep deprived.
We all have that.
Yeah.
All right, why don't you go popcorn it to someone?
Emily.
Righty, and for those of you who don't know me, I am DASC's SSD advisor. So it's nice to see some familiar faces. It's also great to see some new faces. So looking forward to getting to know some of the new members. I would say my high of the week, I'll bounce off of what Niley said. I got a foster dog this week.
Oh my goodness.
So, yes, she's in the other room right now. You don't want me to bring her on screen at the moment. So that's been, that would be my high. I think of a low. I don't know. I love fall and I love this cool weather. So I'm just kind of riding on that. I'm like, everything's great. It's cool. 1,000 degrees outside. So that's my mood right now. And I will bounce it to Caroline.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. I would say my pro of the week is that I had a lot of assignments, but they all got turned in and I'm done for the week with that, so it feels really good. Con is definitely that because it's so cloudy and rainy, well, earlier in the week and stuff. I either sleep too much or don't get any sleep at all. So that is really annoying. But yeah, otherwise pretty good week. I don't know who has gone yet and who has not. So I'm gonna.
I'm sorry. I don't think Erica's gone yet.
Okay, perfect. I will pass the torch off to Erica. Go ahead.
My high for the week was that I'm someone who likes cloudy weather, so it was like a huge picker up for me because it looked so nice outside. I like it when it looks kind of drab and dreary. And then my low, I don't think I particularly have one. I've been staying up a lot this week. I think I mentioned last week that I kind of regressed back into my Harry Potter phase. Well, it's still going on, still as strong. It's pretty bad. So I've been just staying up reading books all night or like messing around, like searching up facts, and I'm enjoying it. It's just a little tiring. Oh, and Tara, have you gone yet?
She has.
Oh, sorry.
Tamara hasn't gone yet, so Tamara.
Oh, Tamara. Okay, sorry.
Oh, you're good. My high, I guess it would be that I finally got the cookies that I've been looking forward to, and I also found a tamale place nearby my apartment, so I've been eating there for like the past week. My low is that also, like everybody else, I've been averaging like 3 hours of sleep every day because of how many assignments I have. That's pretty much it. And I guess I'll pass it to you, Cole.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess my high of the week is that I had 2 tests, like one on Monday, one on Tuesday, and I think I did pretty well on them. I mean, it was unfortunate because with my math test, there were some like stupid mistakes that like cost me a few points, which was frustrating, but I'm glad that I got that over with. I guess, let's see here. I don't think I have a low of the week, fortunately. I'm looking forward to the weekend and the tech game. And actually we have another special guest here. Sean, do you have a high and low of the week?
Hi, thanks for inviting me. I guess my high was I successfully completed my first Zoom presentation to a group yesterday and didn't get Zoom bombed, so I was happy about that. And low, I don't know. There's probably a bunch to choose from, but we'll just leave them on the table.
Understandable. Well, thank you guys. Thank you to Sean and Emily so much for joining us. We will have the speaker presentation or speaker panel in a bit, if you will, but I also have a basically kind of an abridged history of adapted sports that I would like to go through with you guys. If you guys don't know, I'm a sport management major and a disability studies minor, and I kind of want to work within adapted sports. So I thought, you know what, I need to do a little research, need to do some, learn about the history. So it was really fun getting to work on this presentation, and I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Can you guys see that all right? Fantastic. Okay, so we have a history of adapted sports. So basically, let me kind of lower the screen here. Okay, so basically a definition of adapted sports. So adapted sports refers to sports that are either being played by disabled people or have some type of variant in the rules or in how exactly it is played because it has been played by people with disabilities. So for instance, say with wheelchair basketball, it's pretty similar to typical basketball, although there are some variations into the rules, but also there are specifically sports that are tailored towards different segments of the disabled community, such as with goalball and people who are blind or visually impaired. So the origin, so it's very interesting because what I've come across is that basically the earliest form of organized adapted sports originated out of the deaf community, and actually going back to the late 19th century, the earliest organized adapted sports were held at the Sports Club for the Deaf in Berlin, Germany. And that kind of arose to a more international standing among the deaf community and within adapted sports. As in 1924, they were the first international silent games, which are now rebranded as the Deaf Olympics, were held for deaf athletes. And so it was organized by Eugene Urbenz, a case I probably butchered that name, but he was the president of the French Deaf Sports Federation, and he was also deaf himself. So got a bit of disability representation in there in terms of the sporting context. So with the Deaf Olympics, it is essentially the earliest form of organized adapted sports for the disabled community, in this case, the deaf community. And so currently there are 21 summer sports and 6 winter sports. And the big difference between the Deaf Olympics versus the Paralympics or the Special Olympics is in terms of having to vary the communication strategies utilized in those events, such as, let's say, for soccer, using flags instead of whistles, or in track using a light to notify the athletes to start running versus like a whistle or buzzer. So the main things in terms of adapted sports for the deaf is changing up the communication strategies to allow for ideal communication there. So continuing on with the origin of disabled sports, we see more integration in terms of adapted sports for the physically disabled. So in 1932, this is a little bit of an interesting factoid, was the establishment of the British Society of One-Armed Golfers. And basically wheelchair sports had a bit of a later history. It started back in the mid-1940s and with the invention of wheelchair polo at the Stoke Mandeville Hospital by Dr. Ludwig Gutmann, who was a Jewish German immigrant who fled Nazi Germany to help in the rehabilitation, if you will, of war veterans. So what we tend to see a lot is the advancement of adapted sports for the disabled through trying to figure out new ways to help rehab war veterans. And so then a few years after that, we see kind of like actually a year after wheelchair polo was enacted at the hospital, I believe that wheelchair basketball became, the game of choice. But we see in 1948, the first Stoke Mandeville Games, which was organized into 16 athletes competing in wheelchair basketball, archery, and table tennis. So this is essentially the foundation for adapted sports for physically disabled people in general, but primarily war veterans, if you will. So the Stoke Mandeville Games either inspired or kind of turned into what is now known as the Paralympics. And the Paralympics looks to include athletes with a variety of different disabilities, specifically physical disabilities, visual impairments or blindness, as well as some intellectual disabilities. So just to be clear, like the Deaf Olympics is separate from the Paralympics because there are different accommodation needs that differ between each games, if you will. And so the first Paralympics games were held in 1960 in Rome. So we see that there's a bit of definitely a large gap in time between the advancement of sports within the deaf community for full organization for people with other disabilities in terms of adapted sports. Something that was really interesting is looking into sports that are adapted specifically for a particular disability segment. In this case, people who are blind, visually impaired. So this is goalball is a sport offered within the Paralympics, and it was invented in 1946 to help with the rehabilitation of World War II veterans. So it's basically in the same vein as earlier with the Stoke Mandeville Hospital in creating different activities for people or veterans who use wheelchairs. Goalball was essentially in that same vein, and it became an official Paralympic sport in 1976. And for people who aren't really too familiar with it, it's a court that is slightly smaller than a basketball court, but utilizes 3 players on each side. And basically they have this ball that has a bell in it because main point is trying to keep the ball from going in one's own goal and blocking it and so on and so forth. And it's just really an interesting game to get to look at for sure. So in terms of the Paralympics, currently there are 22 summer sports and 5 winter sports offered. And before the 1980s, what was utilized was more of a medical classification system, which basically stated that, like, if you have a certain medical diagnosis, then you're automatically put in a certain field. But they moved more towards a functional classification system that is more based upon the ability level for each sport, so on and so forth. So something that's interesting, very helpful towards building up adapted sports within the community was the 1978 Amateur Sports Act, which was passed, which gave more recognition to disabled athletes within the Olympic movement, and therefore allowed for more elite achievement and recognition. And continuing in the same vein of looking at the different disabled sporting entities, we have the Special Olympics, and specifically with Special Olympics, they are an organization that works specifically with people with intellectual disabilities. So I'm not sure if any of you guys are familiar with Eunice Kennedy Shriver. She, of course, she was part of the Kennedy family, but she saw within 1950s, 1960s, how poorly people, specifically more so children with intellectual disabilities, were treated. They would keep them in in homes or institutions, and they're just treated very poorly, and they weren't given the education or the same opportunities as the rest of the general population. So Special Olympics originated from a summer camp that was put on by Kennedy Shriver to meet the demands of families within the area that had children with intellectual disabilities, to be able to give them more opportunities to interact with one another and just have fun with exercising and sports, because turns out, exercise and sports are beneficial to everyone's health. So that certainly helped out with people with intellectual disabilities. So in terms of the Special Olympics, the origin is still a little bit washy in terms of how people with intellectual disabilities were being treated and were being viewed in the 1950s and 1960s. So the first Special Olympics were held in Chicago in 1968. And so that was the first opportunity to really have a public and widespread showing of people with intellectual disabilities being able to, just be able to interact with people in a normal public fashion, and being able to try out a variety of different sports. And so currently, Special Olympics offers 30+ Olympic style sports. And something that is interesting in terms of Special Olympics versus the Paralympics or Deaf Olympics is how much there is community outreach within both the state level and local level. For instance, there's Special Olympics Texas that has a Central Texas division. There's also Special Olympics Austin ISD. So they definitely have widespread community outreach, continuing on from Kennedy Shriver's original vision of being able to offer sports as, a way for people with intellectual disabilities to have that full experience. And so here are some of my sources. I'm gonna go ahead and stop screen sharing. Does anybody have any questions that I can try to answer, or any interesting thoughts?
Cool. I have a question.
Yes.
So, wait, so is Special Olympics specifically only for like intellectual disabilities?
Yes. So although the Paralympics has started, I think relatively recently, has allowed for some people with intellectual disabilities to participate within certain sports and so on and so forth. The Special Olympics was created in mind for people with intellectual disabilities.
I'd like to say something about the Amateur Sports Act. You said
Yes.
it was 1978 when that was enacted,
Yes.
and that was meant to bring sport for people with disabilities up to the level, up to the pinnacle of Olympic sport. But it was just in 2019 that the national governing body changed their name to the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, and it was, so it's been a slow process.
I'm sure it has. It seems to be the case. But yeah, something also to keep in mind is I think in terms of the Paralympics specifically, there are certain governing bodies designated for people with particular disabilities. For instance, there's a federation for athletes with cerebral palsy or people who are amputees, so on and so forth. So, but as we can see, definitely compared to the Olympics, each separate entity seemed to have like a relatively slow road to get recognition. But I think for me, it was definitely interesting to see how that the deaf community was able to mobilize so early on, relatively compared to the other disability groups, if you will.
I think some of that may have to do with just being able to survive like a traumatic injury. Like before, the 1940s, having a spinal cord injury was, and that, paralyzed you was basically a death sentence because there was no, you get some sort of infection or something. So you're like, for thousands of years, spinal cord injury was pretty much, well, this person is done. And once the antibiotics were invented, people could survive these types of traumatic injuries. And then it's like, okay, so now what do you do?
Indeed. And I think something that was very interesting was in terms of, especially with sports, specifically like wheelchair-related sports or sports people with physical disabilities that originated out of people coming back, like veterans coming back from the war, and like seeing that rehabilitation process that with sports offered kind of a sense of a sense of renewed interest in figuring out what they can do.
Yes, unfortunately, war has been a positive thing for creating technological advancements.
Indeed.
Both in general and for people with disabilities.
Indeed. So does anyone else have any thoughts or any questions about the presentation? Because if not, I will go ahead and get on to talking with our speakers here. Okay, so we have Emily Shryock and Sean Meredith. So Emily, I know that you have played with Texas Stampede, which is like the Central Texas area wheelchair rugby team. Can you talk about like your experience first or getting to them, or like what that process was like?
I'll also say that Sean is also a member of the Stampede. That's how we met. It's about 10 years or so ago. So when I first started using a wheelchair, like Sean said, you're kind of like, okay, like what's next? If this is my new life, kind of where are those opportunities to be active, to compete? So I was living in Indiana at the time, and I contacted the local rehab hospital there and was like, hey, what are my options? And they directed me towards wheelchair rugby because that was what was in season at the time. So for those of you who don't know, wheelchair rugby would fall into the same kind of category as goalball is that it doesn't have really an able-bodied equivalent. Even though it's called rugby and there is an able-bodied version of rugby, they're very different sports. So wheelchair rugby is played on a basketball court. It's played 4-on-4, and it is a contact wheelchair sport. So the rugby wheelchairs are kind of built like steel tanks, built to ram into each other to stop the other team from advancing the ball up the court. So rugby was the first sport that I played. Rugby is also unique because it is a co-ed sport. So because only quadriplegics or folks who have a disability that affects all 4 limbs, so your arms and your legs, can play wheelchair rugby. And so because of that, it's a fairly small population, which means that there aren't enough people to field men's teams and women's teams. So it is a co-ed sport. There aren't a lot of women who play, but that does add an interesting element to that. So I played on the Indiana team. When I moved to Texas, I played here, and then I've also been on the national development team, and through that had an opportunity to travel and compete internationally. So sport can be a great opportunity just to have fun, connect with community, and stay active, but it also can be a platform to open up a lot of other opportunities for travel, kind of finding new career paths and ways to connect and engage. I've also dabbled in a lot of other sports. So I play tennis. I've done half marathon, several shorter races, 5Ks, 10Ks in my track chair, hand cycling, and triathlons. So a lot of different ways to stay active. Most adapted sports do use different wheelchairs. So in my garage right now, I have rugby chair, track chair, hand cycle, tennis chair. So four different wheelchairs. So that takes up a lot of space and can also be pretty expensive. And normally you get to come to Adapted Sports Night, and that would be part of our Disability Awareness Month events. So I'm sad that we all can't be together and have a chance to get to try out some of these sports together, but this is feeling like a little opportunity of that at least.
Indeed, and I'm curious to know, like, what your favorite like experience has been in terms of adapted sports, or like with the wheelchair rugby team specifically.
So rugby is definitely my favorite sport, and in 2016, I did have the opportunity to travel to Russia as part of a sports diplomacy program, and that was pretty incredible. We got to host a wheelchair rugby clinic for the Russian wheelchair rugby team. And so that was just really fun. They didn't speak English, we didn't speak Russian. We had an interpreter who knew nothing about sport. And it was just fun, to find those connections that even though we couldn't verbally communicate with each other, we're speaking the common language of rugby. So just through gestures and pointing, it was fun to be able to play together and have that opportunity to connect across culture through sport.
Fantastic. And Sean, can you give us a little bit of information into your experience with being a Paralympian? I know that you competed in Barcelona and then Atlanta, specifically in like wheelchair track events.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on something Emily said about going to Russia. It's amazing the transformation that they've made. Because in 1980, the Olympics were in Moscow, but the Paralympics were not, because people with disabilities didn't exist in the Soviet Union. So they said. So the Paralympics were actually in Holland that year. So it's amazing the transformation they've had in 40 years. But I was injured way back 1984. Another Paralympic year that the Paralympics were not held in the host country. I don't know what happened to the country that was supposed to hold them that year, but they ended up being held in Stoke Mandeville in the UK. And I've actually had the honor of going to that facility and competing at that event. It's held every 2 years. The International Stoke Mandeville Wheelchair Games are held in the 2 years in between the Olympic years. Uh, so, like I said, I was injured in a construction accident back in 1984. I broke my neck and became a quadriplegic, which doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have any movement from below your chin. I can move my arms and stuff like that. It just means, like Emily said, you have impairment in all four extremities. Mine mainly affects my hands. I went through rehabilitation, took like 5 months altogether to recover from the physical trauma of the injury and to recover from different injuries at the hospital inflicted upon me while I was in there. And I was introduced to wheelchair sports while I was in rehab. I was, therapeutic recreation is a field that's in rehab hospitals where they figure out how to adapt activities that people were interested in before. Like, if you've had a traumatic injury and you have to change the way you do something, like the therapeutic recreation people are the ones that figure out how to, help enable you to figure out how to adapt different activities. And so they just introduced us to a bunch of different things. And one of the things was wheelchair basketball, which I wasn't really very good at. Basketball takes a lot of hand function to be able to shoot well. But I played around with that. That was really my first introduction to wheelchair sports. But we were using these big 50-pound wheelchairs like you'd see in the hospital, because it basically was a hospital. So you're using these industrial chairs. So it was kind of clunky at first, out there in this big, tank rolling around, and you're thinking, oh man, what? But it was a great introduction just to see people that had been in chairs for a while, zipping around the court and doing all these able to engage in these activities. So made me realize, well, I have to figure out a different way to pursue active activities. I wasn't really involved in sports as an able-bodied person, but I found out that taking two limbs out of the equation, I was a lot less clumsy. So, pushing a wheelchair to me was easier than, trying to coordinate my arms and legs at the same time. So, I was able to find a little success, a feeling of, accomplishment from participating in that. I gotten the rehab facility I was in also hosted a regional wheelchair games where they had a variety of different sports. So I had gotten discharged from the hospital, and they encouraged me to come back and check that out. And there were a bunch of different sports. They had swimming, table tennis, basketball, archery, air weapons, track and field. And I always liked to be outside, so I kind of gravitated towards the track. And I also liked things that went fast, which definitely wasn't me at that time. But I was, I watched car racing, motorcycle racing. So watching things go around in circles fast was somehow interesting to me. And I was like, I saw a person out there that obviously had more effects of his disability than I did. He was a higher level quadriplegic, and he was out there just cranking around the track. He definitely wasn't the fastest person out there, but I was like, man, if that guy, this guy's out here, doing this, man, I think I can do it. Just came back the next year and bought a used track chair that, the technology was changing very quickly back then. This was about 1986. So the chair technology was changing rapidly. And I guess this person saw a new guy, and he was like, yeah, I can get rid of this old chair, sell it to this guy. Because I was just out there in my everyday chair that, I just used to, every day to do everyday activities. So people were out there in these really sleek track chairs, which I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they're very stripped down versions of wheelchairs, and they're very specialized for the track. So I bought an old chair and was just slow and came in last place, but somehow stuck with it. And within a couple of years, I got recognized and named to a U.S. developmental team. That's when I had the opportunity to go to the Stoke Mandeville games and came in last in everything, but somehow managed to kind of put that behind me and stick with it, and eventually got better. Made several international teams and went to the Pan American Games in 1990. Got named to the biggest change was I was going to community college out in Virginia, and I was actually my roommate was the person that I first saw going around the track that kind of inspired me to pursue racing. So he encouraged me to come move out of where I was living and go back to school, do something with my life. And so we would train together, and I eventually got enough credits at community college where I was looking for a 4-year university to go to. And I realized some of the people that were beating me on the track at the national level were from the University of Illinois, and looked into their program, found out that was like the first university for, I can't think of the word I was looking for, Institute of Higher Education, that allowed people with disabilities to attend classes, and were eventually mainstreamed into the main campus in Urbana-Champaign. This was after World War II. This was back in 1946. They started the program out there, and so they've had a great number of successful wheelchair athletes over the years. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go there, to go to school. And that's, they had a training program. It was, you're training 6 days a week, pushing, working out. There was probably 20 other wheelchair track athletes there. They also had a men's and women's wheelchair basketball team and a wheelchair rugby team. So it was just like sports, just the place for wheelchair sports. So that training program out there, and the discipline and the science that they put into it, allowed me to elevate my participation of where I was picked for the Paralympic team in 1992. And that was just an amazing opportunity. It was something I would have never dreamed of had I still been walking. I had no aspirations of any competition at that sort of level. And like Cole said, that was in Barcelona, Spain. So it was, just an incredible opportunity. First day I rolled out on the track, and there were like tens of thousands of people in the stands, which was just amazing. You may find this hard to believe, but wheelchair sports aren't particularly popular in the United States. If you don't know somebody that's actually participating in them, you might not even know they exist. And to go to a stadium with 50,000 people cheering, and the King of Spain was in attendance, it was just really just awe-inducing. So that was a just amazing opportunity, and I ended up doing fairly well there. I was in 5 events, and I in the 200 meters, somehow I was able to come up with a gold medal in that. Nobody had really knew me before that, so I hadn't really done that well in my other international sports competitions. But in between that time, I had gone to the University of Illinois and was training, was learning, how to do what I was doing, and kind of surprised some people. Were like, who's this guy? And we had 2 relay teams over there made up of all quadriplegics, where we got the gold medal and set the world record in 2 relay events over there. So it was just an amazing trip. Went to the World Championships in Berlin in 1994. It's the hottest track meet I've ever been to. It was like 35 Celsius every day over there with no air conditioning, and rationed to 3 liters of water per person per day. So it was an interesting event. Came away with 2 bronzes in that. Wasn't my best performance, and got to compete in 1996. Was in the Atlanta Paralympic Games, so it was very, very exciting to be able to compete at that level in my home country. What was a little disappointing was the amount of spectators that were there, because it was not very widely advertised out of the southeast of the U.S. So it was a really different experience than Barcelona. First time I rolled out onto the track in Atlanta, I'm like, hey, I'm home. People are going to be going wild in the stands, and rolled out, and there was like 100 people in a 100,000 seat stadium. It's like, wow, you could hear a cricket in the corner. My friend was up on the balcony, and he yells my name, and I could pick him right out. Hey, how you doing? So that was a little disappointing, competing in my home country, and not really. I don't think the athletes with disabilities really got the recognition that everybody deserved, because the Olympics is such a huge undertaking, and just over the top pageantry and everything. And then the Paralympics were just kind of and also something that was tacked on at that time. I'm hoping that we'll do better in 2028 when they host the Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. I know a few people that are working on the organizing committee out there, some former Paralympians, so we're really hoping to put on a good show in 2028. I said I also played wheelchair rugby, where I got to meet Emily, who's one of the toughest wheelchair rugby players out there. She's awesome player. I love to watch her play. And I don't think we ever played together at the same time. I was a coach for a while, and then I was semi-retired, and then came back. So we haven't gotten to be on the court together as much as I would like, but that was always fun. Our Texas Stampede wheelchair rugby team won the national championship 4 times since I've been associated with them, since 1999. So it's a lot of fun. I did that in college, just kind of, I was so focused on track and road racing and my degree and stuff. I just basically did rugby as an outlet, just something fun to do. And we actually had a great group of guys up there. We had people that would, they came to go to school there just because it was known for its accessibility, and also had like an assisted living facility right on campus, which attracted a lot of people with higher or more involved disabilities. We had people came in there in power wheelchairs and got introduced to wheelchair rugby, and started pushing manual chairs, and were interested in working out, and got introduced to things that they may never have thought was possible. If you have a high level spinal cord injury and you're a quadriplegic, like your doctor doesn't really know. They just look in a book. Oh, well, it says you may be able to push to the mailbox or something if you work real hard. So they set the bar kind of low. So people would come there having no idea what their potential was, and just to see that unlocked, you know, in somebody that thought they were just going to use a power chair and, you know, be resigned to a sedentary lifestyle, to be able to, you know, to do this active, dynamic sport, you know, be on a team with a bunch of other people, you know, and it was just, you know, such a great learning experience, just, you know, because of all the players would learn from each other and figure out how to do things, and, you know, talk about just, you know, you kind of going through the same thing, the same kind of disability, just sharing techniques for independent living. And, you know, it's just, you know, really amazing some of the transformations that I saw through participation in wheelchair sports. I really can't say enough about it. But
Awesome.
Here I've gone on for 10 minutes.
No worries. I actually was wanted to get a little bit more deeper into like, so in terms of like, when you were going to University of Illinois, did you know like any other like major schools or major universities that had as much of a presence or a program for certain disabled sports as Illinois did at the time? Or
yeah, Illinois was the only one that really had a top level racing program. There were several other schools that had basketball programs. There's actually an intercollegiate league within the National Wheelchair Basketball Association. So there were some small schools. It's expanded quite a bit since I went to school. I was at Illinois back in the 90s. So there was like Edinburgh University, which you probably never heard of. It's in Pennsylvania. Wright State in Ohio. A bunch in the upper Midwest, like southwest Minnesota state or something. I'm not sure how it all, you know, came centered in the Midwest, but a lot of these places weren't places that, you know, people in wheelchairs really gravitated to, like Whitewater, Wisconsin. You know, Illinois wasn't spectacular as far as the climate and stuff went, but, you know, it was an awesome place to go to school. Now there are a lot more programs in bigger like Division I schools. Like the University of Arizona has a huge sports program where they offer men's and women's wheelchair basketball, track and field, tennis, rugby. University of Alabama has a huge program now. They're mostly centered on basketball, but yeah, Illinois was definitely the pioneer going way back, and like I said, they had the premier racing program, and they actually now the U.S. Paralympic Training Center for wheelchair track is at the University of Illinois. It's in the thing that we just called the rehab center when I was there, for lack of a better name. It's got a fancy new name and a sign outside, and they really redone this. It's a fairly old building. They redone it very nice, where they have a state-of-the-art roller room in the basement with all sorts of, you know, high-tech training gadgetry and stuff. It's, you know, really amazing how far the technology's gone, and, you know, I'm just really proud to be a part of that.
awesome. And I was also curious to know, like, in terms of like contrasting your experience with in Barcelona versus Atlanta, at least in terms of like audience attendance, do you think that just like in that time, like in the 90s specifically, that like adapted sports were just a lot more popular in Europe versus in the US? Or what do you think, like, what do you think, if anything, caused like that distinction or that like major contrast in attendance?
Well, athletics in general, like say track and field, is much more popular in Europe than it is here. So maybe that had something to do with you know, having more people interested in the track events. But it was just a matter of, let's say maybe the Paralympic movement had kind of advanced farther in Europe for whatever reason. I don't know. There's a lot of, you know, societal issues, just attitudes towards people with disabilities, and such as that, where for some reason or another we're maybe not quite as advanced as maybe we could be, and for whatever reason wheelchair sports aren't really marketed here in the US. For so many years, like, having a disability and using a wheelchair was something to be pitied, or you felt you were supposed to feel sorry for people with disabilities or something. So maybe that has had a bit of an impediment in really getting adapted sports the recognition that they deserve.
Gotcha.
One, have you seen the movie Rising Phoenix?
I have not. I don't think. No.
It's on Netflix. It's a really good kind of retrospective on the kind of the evolution of not wheelchair, but sports for people with disabilities over the years. And it really touches on Ludwig Gutmann and has a little bit of his backstory there. He was, just an amazing person, his story. But they had like one line about the Atlanta games in there. They were, went back to Rome and showed some footage from back there. And, this is what was happening. And they came to Atlanta and they showed a picture of, a race going on in a rainstorm. And they just said, Atlanta was a disaster. I was like, oh, wow.
My goodness.
So glad to have been a part of that. It was like the only thing that they said about it, which was a little disappointing, but it's also telling.
No, that's very understandable. And I think this is a question just for both you and Emily, but like, have you guys noticed any like major evolution, like any evolutions within adapted sports since you guys have started playing, and like in your relative sports or relative fields at all, or?
Well, I think we're going back to war, adding to the disabled or sports for people with disabilities. There's a lot more people participating these days. So unfortunately, we have a lot of people that are getting injured in these overseas things that have been going on for the last 20 years. So there are a lot of people getting introduced to adapted sports, like in VA hospitals and whatnot. So that has maybe helped to bring more visibility to adapted sports. Unfortunate as the cause behind that may be. But we're also getting, now the Americans with Disabilities Act has been in place for 30 years. So you're getting people now that, didn't know the time before when, you were just, if you were denied access to something, you really didn't have any recourse. If you go to your local gym and they had 2 steps to get in, you're like, hey, what's going on? They're like, nobody in a wheelchair has ever been in here. So that's why we don't have a ramp. It's like, did you ever think that if you had a ramp, somebody in a wheelchair may come in your facility? So just having the Americans with Disabilities Act has, I think, really increased just everyday life opportunities for people with disabilities. There's more things going on, things that are accessible to you that before the ADA was enacted that was definitely not the case. So, Emily?
I think I haven't been part of this, but I've watched it happen, and it's exciting is seeing kids getting involved. So kids with disabilities getting involved in sports at younger ages. The Texas University Interscholastic League now includes some wheelchair sports in their school competition. So track is one. I think they're trying to add tennis. So students can compete for their high school, as an athlete with a disability. And just to see that happen is pretty cool, pretty incredible. adaptive sports tend to be pretty segregated because you need to have like a whole wheelchair basketball team, and most, high school districts wouldn't be able to support that. So some of the sports that are individual, so track, tennis, swimming, you can compete against your own time. So it's really exciting to see that. That may be a good future DASC field trip if we're able to be in person in the spring. The state championships for UIL are held at UT. And so to see, high school students who have qualified for the state meet, just another example of, as Sean mentioned, now kids who are growing up with the ADA and they're like, hey, all my friends are competing in sports. Why can't I compete in sports? That having a disability, a physical disability isn't, an automatic disqualification. And there's now, laws behind that so that when a student says, hey, I want to participate, the school says, oh no, we can't do that. They've got some legal backing behind them. And there are also just more resources to be able to say, to a school district, here's somebody who can help you find equipment, help you find coaching. So that's a really exciting and positive trend that's just going to raise the level of sports because, as Sean said, he got involved after he got hurt. Now we're having these little kiddos, who've been pushing a wheelchair or competing in track since they were, young. So just what that's going to do to continue to advance the sports, all sports, is really exciting.
Awesome, definitely.
The University Interschool is just really amazing, the growth of that over the 5 years since it's been in place. And it's a great showcase because people from all over the state come to this meet to watch their kids or family members, and they're also seeing this adapted sports event just being it's just another event. Next up, the 100-meter boys dash for wheelchairs, and it's just like, oh, and there's thousands of people in the stadium being exposed to that and seeing it as genuine sport instead of something, oh well, that's really great, these people can do that. They see these kids are out there competing, training, just like their able-bodied peers. It just really normalizes the whole thing. It's really been great.
Definitely. And I think so we can end a little bit early here, but I'm just wanting to give anybody else the chance to ask a question if they had one. Anybody is interested?
I have a question. I'm wondering, what was you all's training like? Like, what was your training regimen, and how did you guys train for all of this?
So it's different by sport. So like wheelchair rugby is a team sport. So on the local level, we would usually have practices 2 or 3 times a week as a team, but then you're also doing a lot of training on your own outside of that. So strength and conditioning drills, speed work, and then when you come together as a team, it's more practicing kind of the strategy of the game. So that's obviously different for an individual sport. So I'll let Sean speak to that and tell you what it's like to train and compete at that top level.
Yeah, when I was competing at the Paralympic level, we trained 6 days a week. We'd have 3 days of weight and strength training, and we'd also have at least 4 days of pushing in the racing chair, sometimes more, where we're pushing anywhere from, depending on what you were training for, you'd be pushing, 40 to 80 miles a week. Sometimes more. If you're training for marathons, you're going out and pushing 20 miles, 3 or 4 times a week. Going for shorter distances, of course, you're working on more technique and not so much distance. But we would be on the track and out on the beautiful flat roads of central Illinois, pushing as long as the weather was okay, which for several months out of the year was not really feasible. So we did a lot of indoor training on stationary rollers, where we had a coach where it's all he did was just design workouts for us, and he would break the competition season down into phases where and maybe in the beginning of the season, you're just working on developing a lot of strength and just doing slow, continuous pushing. And as the competition season moves on, you work more on technique and strategy, and maybe backing off of the weightlifting some to concentrate more on pushing. So it was just an amazing transformation from going, when I was just living on my own, where I grew up. It was just me and, my friend that would help me tape my gloves up and stuff and be like, okay, well, I'll just go out here and push around the track for an hour or something, and not really having any structure to going into that environment where, they really looked at it from the scientific side, and, built training programs, based on, similar programs for able-bodied athletes, where they really treated it like, this is an athletic endeavor rather than just something to do to spend your time. So we did a lot of training, and it was having, a team with 20 people on it was just amazing, because there was always somebody there that was your same speed. We had, a wide range of abilities. There was always somebody there that you could push with, somebody that was, about your same level in the weight room and that. So it was a great motivator to have, the other people behind you, and, people that, you could work with, and really simulate actual racing situations. Like, we'd have a pack of like 10 chairs on the track just doing drills and stuff. And so it was a lot of fun, a lot of work, but a lot of fun.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions by chance? Or
Yes, I do.
I think you cut out a little bit there, Caroline, at least on my end.
Yeah, our internet's not been terribly well. I can type out the question if it's not working.
I think the audio is better now.
Okay. Cole mentioned that both of you are involved at UT, and I was just wondering, what kind of resources does UT offer its students specifically for adapted sports, and if you think like they could or should do more?
So UT has found our most success with partnering with community organizations. So we have offered wheelchair tennis, I think, for the past 2 or 3 years. So we've worked with the UT Club Tennis for volunteers, as well as the Austin Adapted Sports. So Austin Adapted Sports provides the wheelchair, so they provide the equipment, and then we have it at Whitaker Fields for UT members as well as community members. We have offered our Adapted Sports Night. We've done that for the past, I think, almost 10 years, maybe. So that's been kind of open to everybody, just more of an introduction. And then we've also have offered wheelchair basketball clinics. And again, that's been a partnership with the community. So we're always open to doing more. I'm not sure if y'all might know Ami. She was the student government vice president last year. She did work with an organization called Ainsley's Angels to purchase a different kind of a running chair. So UT has that. So she's participated in the Longhorn Run with that. So a lot of the sports that have been involved have been driven by students, and students saying, hey, we want to have this. And then we work together to figure out how to make it happen. We did host goalball practices. So we have a UT student who is very involved in goalball. So we have hosted those practices. Again, a mix of campus and community members. So y'all, if you didn't know this before, you do now. I'm very committed to adapted sports. I think there's just so much opportunity. Sean spoke a little bit to just that unlocking potential, and really, taking taking somebody and kind of shattering their expectations of what they thought they could do, as well as a great opportunity for building connection and community. So if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I've got an idea, how can we make this happen? I love finding ways to, make that happen. What partners do we need? Who do we need to talk to? How can we make this happen? Rec Sports has been a great partner in that. They're the ones, who let us use their space for tennis and the basketball clinics. So they're really committed to that as well, knowing that a lot of the activities that they, offer aren't accessible to all students. So, they offer open, court time for basketball. Well, that's not necessarily going to work for a student in a wheelchair to roll up and join that. So they're very aware of that, and they're also been a really good partner. So if y'all have ideas, please bring them. We'd love to explore that. Obviously, it's a little hard now when we're restricted from gathering, but moving forward, I think there's a lot of exciting potential that we could explore.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that.
Gotcha. Does anyone have any last minute questions or? Okay, well, thank you so much, Sean and Emily, for coming. It was amazing getting to hear y'all's stories. I really appreciate y'all's time, and it was amazing to see you all. And can't wait to see you guys next week for the next DASC meeting. Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
It's great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting us. And yeah, it's good to see DASC still going strong in the virtual world.
Yes, indeed. Okay, bye y'all.
Have a good night.
Great.
Thank you guys so much again.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.